Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Forum at St. Bart's. My name is Peter Thompson. I'm the Associate Rector for Formation and Liturgy here, and I'm really glad to be joined this morning by Professor Teresa Berger of Yale Divinity School and the Institute of Sacred Music at Yale. She is Professor of Liturgical Studies and the Thomas Golden Professor of Catholic Theology. She's also the author of At Worship, Liturgical Practices in Digital Worlds. And we're so grateful to have her here to talk about this moment that we're in and how virtual liturgy is expanding and changing. Thank you so much for being here, Professor Berger.
Thank you for the invitation, Peter, and it's good to see you again, even if it's virtually.
Likewise. So I was your student a few years ago, and I remember then you were talking about virtual liturgy. Can you talk a little bit about how your interest got started in this area?
Yes, it actually predates COVID-19 and virtual worship going viral by many, many years. I initially got interested in liturgical and devotional practices of prayer and reading the scriptures that had migrated online because of an accident. I lost my beloved print prayer book on an airplane. And it was a prayer book I'd used for decades in my language of origin. It held not only prayers that I knew by heart, but photos and pressed flowers and other mementos. So I lost this treasure in an airplane, couldn't retrieve it. And in this moment of having to reconfigure routines of how I prayed every day, I stumbled into digitally mediated forms of prayer. And out of curiosity, tried them on, so to speak, and then discovered fairly rapidly that my own scholarly field, namely liturgical studies, had already pronounced these practices as utterly bad, devoid of meaning, giving into contemporary high-tech culture, and you can continue the list. And it startled me because my own experience of these early digitally mediated practices of prayer was not entirely negative. It was a bit odd initially, but it certainly wasn't an overwhelmingly negative experience. And in some ways, it opened up some avenues unexpectedly. It certainly enabled me, as much as one can as a human being, to encounter God in new spaces. And so in this disjunction between my own experience and what my field told me I should think, I started reading more, started investigating more, and in the end decided, I'm just gonna write a short, sweet, quick book about this and be done with it. So that was 2018 and or 17, and I moved on in terms of my scholarly interests. And then COVID-19 happens, and everybody, of course, is thinking about liturgical practices and devotional practices, prayer, communities gathering in digitally mediated forms. And here we are.
Here we are indeed. Have you been surprised by what has happened since COVID-19 began in terms of liturgical practices in digital worlds? Did you foresee this at all?
Well, nobody could foresee COVID-19. Thinking back now, I should not have been surprised by everything moving into digital mediation. guess what did surprise me is the intensity and the creativity and the almost frenetic production of devotional, ritual, liturgical materials, so much so that I have now gone back into my garden to pray. And what you see behind me is not my actual garden. It's a medieval monastic herb garden in Germany, but just going completely offline again because I have online overload, as I guess many people might experience at this point. But as one might expect in a situation of where we all have to improvise and muddle through, in a sense, there is the gamut from really very thoughtful materials to quickly put together stuff that just wants you to run away screaming. And filtering all of it, I think, can be very exhausting, which is where many people now are.
Sure. I was struck in the prefatory material to your book. You mention Clare of Assisi and Isidore of Seville as the patron saints of television and the internet, respectively. I wonder if you can talk a little bit about them and why they're the patron saints of those two things.
Yeah, the Roman Catholic Church, which is my ecclesial home, but other communities also have a long history of venerating saints and making new saints for new problems. So when television comes around, the question is, oh my goodness, this is a totally new medium. You know, who could be the saint of television? And of course, there were concerns over the evil television might do. So you needed a saint for that. And along comes Clare of Assisi, medieval saint, friend of Francis of Assisi, who had a vision in her cell one day. She had wanted to go to Mass, but was too sick. And God granted her the gift of seeing the Mass that was being celebrated at a physical distance so clearly that later she was able to identify the priests she knew who were in this Mass. So this seeing beyond her four walls made her the patron saint of television. And I, in fact, have, and other Catholics have, little statues of Saint Clare that you put next to your television. So mine was given to me by a Presbyterian friend who thought it was a big joke. And this Clare actually lights up in the darkness. For me, that's not a joke, but okay. Isidore of Seville is the patron saint of the internet, not because he saw particularly well or had visions. This is a early medieval 6th, 7th century very learned bishop in Spain who collected the then known knowledges in a vast library and texts, that is, and became the channel of late antique and Greco-Roman wisdom for the Middle Ages, because he gathered it all together in one place. And so that is the connection to the internet as a great gatherer of information.
Excellent.
And again, as with Claire, you now have images and prayers to Saint Isidore to, protect your computer from viruses and help you find things online and all those other good things.
Excellent. I encourage you, those of you who are watching, to insert your comments in the live chat or the comments, or you can also send your questions or comments to me at pthompson@stbarts.org, and I will ask them of Professor Berger. I'm curious, Professor, the vignette about Claire really stood out to me in this moment, because there are all these debates among church people about the Eucharist, virtual Eucharist, and how that might work. And curious what your thoughts are on that, now that that is much less of a hypothetical issue than it might have been a few months ago.
Yeah, what can I say? First of all, I think we need to realize that experiments with online communion, cyber Eucharists, whatever terminology you choose, have been going on for over 20 years. There is a first text the earliest one I know of, there might have been earlier ones, from 1997, of a cyber Eucharist. And Methodist churches, for example, for years now had to struggle with ministers who experimented with versions of online communion. The Presbyterian Church allowed a minister in a couple of years ago, I think, in a virtual reality world, Second Life, to share bread and wine through avatars. So there has been over many years a pushing of those practices of experimentation, improvisations. It comes to a head, of course, in COVID-19. What I would say is that depending on where you are ecclesially and with your theology of the Eucharist, this is either a total no-no or relatively easy to do. So Catholic and Orthodox churches are not going there. Except that I know anecdotally that even Catholics entering into a live streamed mass might set up bread and wine in front of the screen and consume it at the point when the priest consumes the Eucharist. Now, if you pressed me as a theologian to say, what are they actually consuming? Is it a snack in front of the screen? Or is it the body and blood of Jesus? As a Catholic, I would have to go in one direction rather than the other. But there are other communities, again, the Presbyterian Church, evangelical communities, who with their particular Eucharistic theology that emphasizes the sign nature of bread and wine, that's digitally mediated practices of Eucharistic sharing are more easily opened up. And then, of course, you have to also figure in the medium that is being used. A Eucharist via Zoom is something different from a Twitter Eucharist, is something different from a virtual reality environment. So in terms of thinking through this phenomenon, there is a lot of work to do. But as is so often the case in contexts of need and heightened anxieties, the experimentation rushes ahead.
Mm.
And if I say to people, let's take a deep breath and think about this more deeply, I have to recognize that that's me as a professional theologian who gravitates towards doing what she is trained to do, namely to sit back and think deeply. One doesn't always have that luxury.
Sure. Yeah, so there have been a number of questions about how this is changing the nature of liturgies on television. Specifically, folks have mentioned Archbishop Fulton Sheen, Joel Osteen. How do you think teleliturgy has changed with the use of the internet and online technologies, and the fact that now many parishes can stream services? It's not just the one that has the resources to put it on network television, for example.
Yeah. I think it has forced that liturgical practice much more into the foreground. Even people who would never have dreamt of entering into a liturgical space online are now forced to do so. And are discovering, I think, mostly that it's better than nothing. Mm-hmm. And that then, I think, opens up a different lens to practices that for many years already have been happening in technologically mediated ways. I should say at the same time, I always get a bit frustrated when people think gathering in an offline space, let's say St. Bart's or my my parish at Yale, isn't also a high-tech affair. Think of the sound systems we employ. The sophisticated sound systems, the lighting, the this, that, and the other. So it's not as if offline communities of worship are off the tech grid.
Right.
Although there is a vast gulf between technologically privileged communities and those who aren't.
Yeah. So there was an article this week by Diana Butler Bass. The issue of virtual communion has been controversial in the Episcopal Church with passions strong on both sides. And she mentioned a conversation that she had with Phyllis Tickle before she died. And Phyllis Tickle, of course, famously said that there's a giant rummage sale every 500 years. Do you think this is kind of a Reformation moment for the Church? Another Reformation moment? Famously, of course, the printing press was so important to the Reformation 500 years ago. Are we at that point, or is it not quite that dramatic?
Oh, I think it's clearly as dramatic in terms of the medium, the key cultural medium changing or having changed. But the context and the meaning of this media change is quite distinctly different from the 16th century. And it probably, and this might be the scholar in me again coming out, it might help if we think longer term and over more than the last 5 centuries. The Reformation and the invention of the printing press is the sort of quick go-to. Oh, we've already had one major media change, and now we have another one. Well, truth be told, we've had far more Christian worship, and the worship on which it builds, Jewish worship, has gone through several changes of media. Some of them many people never think about, but I do because that's my job. Think of evening prayer before the invention of electric light. So lighting of lamps became integrated into the ritual of evening prayer, or a moment of prayer was added to the simple utilitarian act of having to light lamps. With electric light, that whole nexus of prayer and the rhythm of the day changes in fundamental ways. And it's a change of medium. So, yes, we are in a change of medium now, but we have been there throughout history, and the Reformation and the printing press isn't the only one.
Sure. None of us really knows when exactly this current crisis is going to end. But what do you foresee when that happens? Depending on how that happens, what do you see as the future? Is this proliferation of online worship, is it here to stay?
I think versions of online worship are here to stay, and congregations that have entered into that world might do well to continue providing it for shut-ins, for people who are sick, you name it. At the same time, I think, at least looking at I'm thinking of Germany here particularly, which just this weekend opened some churches up to brick and mortar churches, to people gathering again for worship. The changes are so fundamental to how people can gather now, at least at this point. So you aren't allowed to sing. You have to sit apart. You have to wear masks. You have to register before you can come to worship, and only a certain number of tickets are given out, and so on and so forth. That will be with us for a while. And if there is another flare-up of the pandemic, we might have to go back to virtual only. It's hard for me right at the moment to see us getting back to where we were in February of 2020. Mm-hmm. But I'm not a prophet.
Sure. Yeah, none of us can really know for sure at what kind of trajectory this will take. You mentioned the digital divide. For folks that don't have a stable internet connection, is this how are they worshiping during this time? Are you aware of how is this impacting them?
It depends. I think people without any access to digital technologies will do what people have always done: pray in their own spaces. It's not as if that isn't or cannot be a place for prayer. But there are also mixed media worship services. A friend of mine serves in a rural parish in North Carolina, where especially older parishioners simply don't traffic in digital media, and they'll call in to worship on a phone, landline phone. So I think people are doing what people of faith have always done, finding God in their own circumstances. And if they don't have access to digital technologies, well, people of faith never had access to that before the 1980s, and they did just fine handing on the Christian faith to us. So I don't think our faith or our practices of faith will die because people don't have access to digital mediations. I'm not trying to make light of the fact that almost half of the world still doesn't routinely have access to the internet. And that's a marker of, that it continues to be a marker of privilege. Having that access is a marker of privilege.
Sure. So I do encourage those of you who are watching to continue to send in your questions. You can do that through the live chat on YouTube or the comments on Facebook. You can also email them to me at pthompson@stbarts.org. In your book, Professor Berger, you sort of shy away from making any claims about God in the wake of this increase in digital practices. Is this all teaching us anything about the nature of God? God, of course, is unchanging, and yet do we see God a little bit differently because we are worshiping so much through technology?
I hope I wasn't shying away from God, saying anything about God in my book. I basically only claimed that God wasn't the problem in thinking through digital mediation, because I'm convinced that God doesn't find it any more difficult to render God self-present in my garden than rendering God self-present in digital mediation. So I do think that the medium of digital technologies invites particular ways of encountering God and thinking about God's presence to come to the fore in ways that, let's say, a print medium might not. And it seems to me that digital mediation privileges not the print saturated encounter with God's presence, but the sort of multi-mediated, think medieval cathedral, lots of images, vast space, more mobile ways of thinking about the presence of God. I've been startled reading through the Psalms. I committed to join the nuns who are the heirs of Hildegard of Bingen in the Rhine Valley, in praying one psalm every day, beginning with one, and we are, I think, at 49 now. Anyway, in the 40 range of the Psalms, there are both the Psalms that celebrate Zion as the place where God is present. But embedded in some of the older Psalms are also these traditions of the mobile sanctuary through which God journeyed with God's people through the desert to the promised land. And it struck me that in our time now, under COVID-19, it may be that these facile celebrations of the temple don't quite resonate with us as much as the sort of older tradition of God on the journey with God's people in a little sanctuary that one could carry, much like a cell phone. Well, it was a bit larger, but so I do think that this moment in time and digital technologies invite specific images and ways of encountering God to come to the foreground that maybe weren't as strongly present in the years just before.
Sure. So one of the things those of us who have been leading religious communities during this time have noticed is that we're getting, in some ways, more engagement online than we get in person. And I wonder if you have any thoughts on that phenomenon, as well as kind of what are the ramifications for evangelism? Is evangelism now primarily digital?
Oh, I have very fond memories of my own time at the Church of England college, an evangelical one, where we actually went out and preached the gospel on street corners. I would never want to miss that, even in digital mediation. That said, you're noticing something that people who studied and worked in online sanctuaries noticed early on, namely that the entry level into sacred space online, the threshold, seems to be slightly lower for those curious, but who wouldn't enter an actual physical church door. That's too high a threshold for some people. But entering digitally with a click, sometimes anonymously, and being able to be present without literally rubbing up next to someone opens some doors. And there are particular demographics in some of the studies that I've seen, at least, for whom that is important. People who have been hurt by churches also seem to find online spaces more easy to enter. So yes, you are not alone in noticing that it brings some unexpected visitors into sacred space.
Definitely. How has COVID-19 changed you as an academic? You're looking at what's happening. How both your examination of virtual liturgy as well as the current pandemic, how do they change the way you look at liturgy and study liturgy?
It's a very good question and not an easy one. So let me try and find a path through that. Two things occur to me immediately. The one thing for myself is that I come back again and again to what initially drew me into liturgical studies. And it was this sense of seeking a path to draw closer to God under the signs and symbols of my tradition. I come back again and again to what's crucial is the seeking to encounter God, not the safeguarding the signs and symbols of my tradition. And I've gotten frustrated with colleagues of mine, not so much here or even in this context, but in my country of origin, who seem to have nothing better to do but to sort of insist on their scholarly lenses and what constitutes appropriate worship, and to repeat that and pontificate. If I value my scholarly discipline, but I value people's path towards an encounter with God more.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that encounter always has to be truthful to the moment in which we find ourselves. I sometimes in the past have used an example from when I volunteered in a homeless shelter, and one of the guests would come through the line and say, "Can I have a second piece of fried chicken?" So the only appropriate answer, I think, is yes or no if you have limited resources. A wrong answer, although theologically correct, would be Jesus loves you. That's theologically correct, but it's a denial of the need of the moment.
Mm-hmm.
So repeating the grand truth has its place, but not in a homeless shelter at that point in time when someone asks whether they can have a second piece of fried chicken.
Do you think liturgy itself will change? We're talking about the digital mediation of liturgy, but I was struck by the passages in your book about confessions and sort of the blurring of the line between the sacred and the secular there. Do you think we're going to see liturgy change as the result of this?
It always changes. It's never
static.
The same. Yeah. Even if your text doesn't change, you have changed. The people you serve are constantly changing. Language changes around you. The culture around you changes. So you can try and keep individual elements the same, but their meaning is unstable already, because everything that gives the meaning in a particular context is in flux.
Mm-hmm. And one of the things that's powerful in the book is you look at historical examples as sort of precedents for how liturgy and the mediation of liturgy has shifted before.
Yeah, and the kind of theological struggles and thinking that has gone on. The medieval theologians who wondered, what the hell does the church mouse eat that might nibble on a consecrated host? Does the mouse eat the body of Christ? Well, and they found ways to think around that. It's not that different from asking, what does someone who sets up bread and wine in front of a screen eat? We are thinking about forms of context-specific presences of God.
And one final question that we have relates to how the church has dealt with plagues and other kinds of disease in the past when it comes to worship. How have we altered communion practices, et cetera, et cetera? The Great Plague, or even the Spanish flu of 100 years ago. How did liturgical practices change then, and what might we learn from those periods for today?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm waiting for more work to be done on all of that. In my own Catholic context, some very eager theologians have brought up saints who went and to plague-infested contexts and ministered there, brought the Eucharist because they thought the Eucharist was more important than their own life. And these theologians lambast people and ministers who now say, no, we shouldn't worship together. Human life is important. And they would say, no, receiving the Eucharist is more important than anything. I think there are counterexamples to that. And we do know, but we need more work to be done on that, on historical examples of liturgical practices in response to, and someone is that I know has worked on earthquakes and in Constantinople, and how the church responded liturgically to that. What happened in communities, not only with the plague emerging, but other highly contagious diseases, typhoid, cholera. We have a saint who went to minister in Hawaii to leprosy, to a colony of lepers, and then died there as a leper himself. So I think we have very diverse responses. It would be interesting to map that and not think that we are the first ones who ever had to wrestle with issues like that.
Sure. Well, unfortunately, we have to get ready for our own virtual worship, which will start at 11 o'clock. So we need to stop it there. But very appreciative of you joining us this morning, Professor Berger, of taking the time. And to those of you watching, I both encourage you to join us for worship at 11 o'clock, but I also encourage you to take a look at Professor Berger's book, At Worship, Liturgical Practices in Digital Worlds. It's pretty accessible, and it offers a lot of food for thought for this time.
Thank you, Peter, and thank you, everybody who joined us. Bye.
Bye.